Tonight on Sleepless Mythology, we travel far back in time, back before empires, before pyramids, back to when cities were just learning to be cities, and humans were just figuring out how to write things down. This is the tale of Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love, war and power, a deity who, quite frankly, never learned the meaning of too much. Before we begin, take a moment to comment where you are and what time it is so everyone can see how far these stories reach. Now close your eyes, sink into the covers, take a deep breath and release it, relaxing your face, shoulders, and the rest of your body. Let your thoughts slow, and let this very old tale carry you gently into slumber. Picture yourself in ancient Uruk, around 3200 BCE. The air is heavy with the scent of date palms, and the Euphrates River flows nearby, bringing life to an otherwise unforgiving desert. Uruk's walls rise impossibly high, built of sun-dried mud bricks and ambition. They say it took 1,500 men to walk its circumference, though perhaps they were just taking their time about it. At the city's heart stands Inanna's temple, the Inanna, the House of Heaven. Its walls shimmer with blue glazed tiles because Inanna wasn't exactly known for subtlety. Inanna was complicated. In the morning she might bless lovers with passion. By afternoon, lead armies into battle, and somehow still have energy for an evening of dancing. The people saw her as the morning and evening star, Venus, rising and setting, always changing yet always herself, always demanding attention and usually getting it. She once convinced Enki, god of wisdom, to hand over all the powers of civilization after sharing a few too many drinks with him, which says something about either her cleverness or his capacity for beer. Then there was her sister, Ereshkigal, Queen of the Great Below. While Inanna collected powers and admirers above, Ereshkigal ruled the one place her sister couldn't charm her way into. At least not yet. The sisters were as different as day and night. One ruled above, one below. One collected powers like trinkets. The other maintained the greatest power of all, the final silence that comes to everyone, even gods. And perhaps that's what really bothered Inanna. The thought that somewhere someone might have something she didn't. So she decided to visit the Underworld. She claimed it was to attend a funeral, though showing up uninvited to the Underworld seems an odd way to pay your respects. Was it really grief that moved her? Or was it simply that she couldn't bear the thought of any kingdom beyond her influence? Either way, Inanna made her choice, and when Inanna made up her mind, the universe generally found it easier to simply get out of her way. Now, if you're going to visit the Underworld, you can't just show up in whatever you happen to be wearing. Inanna understood presentation. She adorned herself with the 7 powers of divinity, a crown of pure gold for her head, because even in death one should look regal. Lapis lazuli beads around her neck, deep blue as the evening sky she ruled. Twin egg-shaped stones at her ears, said to hold the whispers of her worshippers. A double strand of beads across her breast, each one holding a different kind of power. A golden hip girdle wrapped around her waist, because even goddesses appreciate good accessories. Her royal robe shimmered around her body, woven with starlight and authority. And in her hand she carried the measure and line, the tools that marked her as civilization's keeper. Before departing, Inanna spoke to Ninshubur, her faithful servant and voice of reason. Though voice of reason might be generous for someone who didn't try harder to talk her queen out of this particular adventure. Still, Ninshubur listened as Inanna laid out her plan. If I don't return in 3 days, make a rather dramatic scene about it. Beat the drums, tear your clothes, generally cause a fuss until someone helps. Ninshubur nodded solemnly, probably wondering if it was too late to seek employment with the less adventurous deity. And so Inanna turned toward the Underworld, a realm so distant yet so near, where dust is the bread and clay is the meat, where light goes to rest and silence goes to think. She approached the first gate, head held high, divinity radiating. The guard, Neti, looked at her, the way guards everywhere look at those who don't have an invitation. State your business, he said, in that timeless tone of gatekeepers who know they're about to hear an interesting explanation. Here's the thing about the Underworld. It has rules. Very specific rules. Rules that don't care if you're a goddess, or how many powers you've collected, or how splendid your royal robe looks. Ereshkigal had her own way of doing things, and that way involved stripping visitors of everything they brought with them. everything that made them who they were. Perhaps it was practical underworld management. Perhaps it was just sibling rivalry taken to its logical extreme. Either way, when Nettie announced that Inanna would have to surrender each piece of her power at each gate, she didn't argue, which for Inanna was rather out of character. At the first gate, Nettie took her crown, the very symbol of her heavenly power, and Inanna, who had never bowed to anyone, found herself ducking to pass through. At the second gate, her earrings were taken. No more whispers of worship to comfort her. Just the sound of her own footsteps, echoing in ways they never had before. Third gate, the necklace. Fourth, the breast ornaments. Fifth, the golden hip girdle. Each piece a surrender, each loss a lesson in humility that Inanna had never planned to learn. At the sixth gate, her royal robe. Now the Queen of Heaven stood like any common soul facing judgment. Probably not the entrance she had originally envisioned. The seventh gate took her final dignity. And so Inanna, collector of powers, ruler of above, defeater of mountains, entered her sister's realm as everyone eventually does, with nothing. Picture, if you will, this moment. Inanna, naked and bowed, before Ereshkigal's throne of shadows. Two sisters meeting again after ages. One who had everything, now having nothing. One who had nothing, now having everything. Ereshkigal sat upon her throne, and her gaze was not exactly warm. Perhaps she was remembering all those bright celebrations above, to which she was never invited. The judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki, looked upon Inanna with eyes of ancient stone. They spoke no words of welcome, made no gestures of kindness, just fixed her with that look reserved for those who arrive, uninvited and overdressed. What happened next was swift, and rather final. The judges spoke their judgment. Their words fell like stones. The dead cannot rule the living cannot rule the dead, and those who choose to visit must pay the price of admission. Ereshkigal fixed her sister with the stare of someone who had waited a very long time for this particular moment. She raised her hand, spoke her words, and Inanna, who had never known defeat, who had gathered every power but wisdom, found herself transformed into something very much like meat, hanging from a hook in her sister's quiet realm. While Inanna hung in the silence below, the world above began to notice her absence. The crops forgot to grow, the animals forgot to mate. Desire itself seemed to fade like an old tapestry left in the sun. It turns out that when you're the goddess of quite so many important things, your absence creates quite a void. 3 days passed, 3 nights followed, and Ninshuba, true to her word, began the process of divine intervention. Ninshuba, proving herself the most competent assistant in mythology, began her rounds of the heavenly offices, first to Enlil, king of the gods, who essentially said, "Not my department," and suggested she try elsewhere. Then to Nanna, the moon god, who displayed all the helpfulness of a customer service representative at the end of a very long shift. Finally she reached Enki, god of wisdom, and conveniently the only deity who seemed to understand that a universe without Inanna might be a bit too orderly for comfort. Enki, being rather clever, created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, which says something about either his personal hygiene or the quality of divine dirt. He named them the Kurgara and Galatur, gave them the food of life and the water of life, and sent them to the underworld with very specific instructions. When Ereshkigal cries, cry with her. When she sighs, sigh with her. When she moans, moan with her. Because sometimes the best way to handle a grudge-holding goddess is just really good active listening. Down in the underworld, Ereshkigal was having a moment. Ruling the land of the dead can be rather taxing on one's mood. When the Kurgara and Galatur arrived, they found her in distress, groaning like a woman about to give birth. Though what she was labouring with was probably several millennia of accumulated grievances. True to their instructions, they echoed her pain. It was perhaps the first recorded instance of group therapy in mythology, and surprisingly it worked. Ereshkigal, moved by finally being heard, offered her sympathetic visitors a gift. They could have rivers of water, fields of grain, all the wealth of the underworld, but they had one request. Just give us that corpse hanging on the hook. Ereshkigal, probably realising this had been Enki's plan all along, had no choice but to agree, A promise is a promise, even in the underworld. But resurrection, like most things, comes with terms and conditions. The ancient laws were clear. Nobody leaves the underworld without providing a replacement. Inanna was restored to life, but now faced an uncomfortable question. Who would take her place? She emerged from the underworld, followed by the Gala demons, who had very strict instructions about collecting on this particular debt. As Inanna ascended back to the world above, the Gala demons followed close behind, like particularly aggressive debt collectors with a very specific quota to meet. They watched as Inanna returned to her realm, where most things had carried on without her. Most things, but not everyone. First, she found Ninshuba still faithfully performing her duties, still dressed in mourning clothes, still making that fuss as promised. Inanna blessed her for her loyalty. At least someone had followed the script. But then there was Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, the Shepherd King. While his wife had been quite literally dead, he hadn't exactly been in mourning. In fact, there he sat upon Inanna's throne, dressed in his finest clothes, looking rather comfortable, as if his wife's descent into the underworld had been more of a convenient vacation than a cosmic tragedy. Now, if you've ever returned home to find someone sitting in your favourite chair, you might understand Inanna's reaction. Though probably not at this scale. She fixed Dumuzi with a look that would have made the underworld seem cosy. The look of a goddess who had just lost everything, gained it back, and found her husband treating her death like an opportunity for career advancement. Inanna raised her hand, fixed Dumuzi with the eye of death, and spoke the word of wrath, which all things considered might have been a slight overreaction. But then again, she'd had a rough few days. "Take him," she said to the Gala demons, who were probably relieved to finally have clear instructions. Dumuzi, displaying the wisdom that had characterized his entire reign, decided this would be an excellent time to try running away. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because Dumuzi had a sister named Inanna, who actually understood something about loyalty. She offered to spend half the year in the underworld herself, trading places with her brother every 6 months. Inanna, perhaps feeling a bit more reasonable, now that she'd had some time to process things, accepted this arrangement, and so it was established. Dumuzi would spend half the year below, during which the earth would grow barren, the crops would wither, and the land would rest. Then Inanna would take his place, the earth would bloom again, and life would return to the land. Some say this is why we have seasons, though one might question whether building an entire climate system around a divine domestic dispute was the most efficient solution. And so ends our tale of Inanna, who learned that some powers can't be taken, only understood, who discovered that even goddesses must sometimes bow to greater laws, and who perhaps realised that if you're going to die and come back to life, it's worth checking on your spouse first. This ancient tale of Inanna echoes through countless stories that followed. Like a template for divine drama, it set patterns we still recognise today. Consider Persephone's journey to the underworld, though she at least got to eat some pomegranate seeds rather than being hung on a hook. The Greeks, it seems, had a slightly different approach to family disagreements, or Orpheus seeking his beloved Eurydice, who really should have read Inanna's story first and learned about the importance of following underworld protocols. Even modern tales of loss and return, of death and resurrection, carry whispers of this first descent, this first understanding that sometimes, to gain something, we must first lose everything. This story was first recorded on clay tablets in ancient Sumer, around 4,000 years ago, written in cuneiform by scribes who probably had no idea. Their words would outlast their civilization. The tablets were discovered in the ruins of ancient cities, buried beneath centuries of desert sand, waiting to remind us that even our newest questions had ancient answers. And speaking of journeys to the underworld, our next tale takes us to ancient Egypt, where another goddess named Isis embarked on her own quest to restore what was lost. Let us drift now from the lands between rivers to the realm of endless sand and sacred waters, where the Nile flows like liquid life through a desert older than memory itself. This is a tale of love and betrayal, of death, and something more stubborn than death. the story of Isis and Osiris, a marriage that not even dismemberment could part. In the beginning there were 5 children, born of the sky goddess Nut and earth god Geb. Osiris, the eldest, destined to rule. Isis, the clever one, mistress of magic. Set, the strong one, lord of storms. Nephthys, the protective one. And Horus the elder, who we won't discuss much, as Egyptian mythology has quite enough Horuses already. Osiris became king of Egypt, and he was rather good at it. He taught humans agriculture, gave them laws, showed them civilization. The kind of ruler who actually improved things, which, as history shows, is rather rare. Isis stood beside him as queen, teaching women to weave, grind corn, and heal the sick. Together they made Egypt prosper, which was their first mistake, because happiness attracts jealousy, like honey attracts flies. Set watched his brother's success with the kind of appreciation that slowly ferments into hatred, the kind that keeps you awake at night, planning elaborate schemes involving measurements and carpentry. Set arranged a banquet, which should have been everyone's first warning. Set wasn't exactly known for his hospitality. He brought out a magnificent chest, inlaid with gold and precious stones, and made an announcement. This chest shall be given to whoever fits inside it perfectly. Now this chest had been carefully measured to fit exactly one person, Osiris, because nothing says fraternal love like custom-made trapped furniture. One by one the guests tried the chest, too tall, too short, too wide, too thin. Then Osiris, perhaps having missed the chapter on suspicious gifts in the king's handbook, stepped inside. The fit was perfect. Set's smile was worse. Before anyone could react, the lid was slammed shut, sealed with lead, and thrown into the Nile. Isis, upon hearing the news, did not take to her bed in grief, didn't tear her hair or rend her garments. She had invented magic, after all, and wasn't about to let a little thing like death get in her way. She cut a lock of her hair, put on mourning robes, and began a search that would become the template for all epic quests to follow. The chest containing Osiris had floated out to sea, eventually washing ashore in Byblos, the Lebanese city, not the library, though that would have been a different kind of story entirely. A beautiful tree had grown around it, so impressive that the local king had it cut down and made into a pillar for his palace, because that's what you do with mysteriously appearing sacred trees. Isis, following divine intuition, and probably a good deal of gossip, arrived in Byblos disguised as a refugee. She befriended the queen's handmaidens, became nursemaid to the royal child, and generally demonstrated that networking was just as important in ancient times as it is now. Each night she would transform into a swallow, flying around the pillar that held her husband, crying out in grief, which was both dramatic and effective as far as search techniques go. Eventually Isis revealed her true identity, requested the pillar, and proved why it's always wise to be kind to mysterious strangers. She extracted the chest, clutched it to her breast, and wailed so loudly that one of the royal children died of fright. She did resurrect him afterward, so no lasting harm done. Back in Egypt, Isis hid the chest in the marshes of the delta and set about the complicated business of reversing death. With help from her sister Nephthys and Anubis, the skilled embalmer, she pieced together the mysteries that would become mummification. She transformed into a kite, hovered over her husband's body, fanned life into him with her wings, and managed what no one had done before. She brought the dead back to life, but Set, out hunting in the marshes, found them, and he was not pleased to discover that his carefully planned fraternity prank had been reversed. This time he wasn't subtle. No elaborate schemes, no custom furniture. He simply cut Osiris into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout Egypt. Because sometimes, when your first plan fails, you just have to improvise. Once again, Isis set out searching. This time with a slightly more complicated task, finding 14 pieces of her husband scattered across Egypt. Like a divine scavenger hunt, but with much higher stakes. She travelled by boat through the marshes, using nets to fish for pieces of Osiris, which is why, to this day, Egyptian fishermen sometimes cast their nets with special prayers. You never know what or who you might catch. Isis found 13 pieces. The 14th, however, was problematic. It had been thrown into the Nile and eaten by 3 different fish, which later became sacred to Isis, though they probably didn't appreciate the honour. This missing piece was, shall we say, rather important to the process of resurrection and to future fertility rites, but we'll get to that later. Isis, proving herself the inventor of more than just magic, created a replacement piece out of gold, which might explain certain royal customs that followed in later dynasties. She then wrapped Osiris in linen, creating the first mummy, and brought him back to life, again. Though this time with some limitations on his earthly activities. Osiris became Lord of the Dead, ruling the underworld from a safe distance, where presumably Set couldn't reach him without filling out proper paperwork first. But Isis wasn't finished. She had one more trick planned. She was pregnant. In the marshes of the Delta, hidden from Set's wrath, Isis gave birth to Horus, a son conceived by magical means from a reassembled father. Best not to think too hard about the logistics. She raised him in secret, protected by scorpions and magic, preparing him for the day he would challenge Set for his father's throne. Young Horus learned everything: how to take the form of a falcon, how to wield weapons of light, how to present his case to divine courts, because even vengeance should follow proper legal channels. Before we get to the boat race, you should know that Egyptian gods were surprisingly bureaucratic. The battle for the throne had to go through proper channels, including a divine tribunal led by Ra himself. Set and Horus appeared before the Ennead, the divine council of 9 gods, to settle their claims to Egypt's throne. After several centuries of debate, gods have different concepts of time, someone suggested a boat race. The challenge seemed simple enough. 2 boats would race across the Nile. The winner would be declared king. But there was one small catch. The boats had to be made of stone. Now, if this seems like an obviously bad idea, remember that Set wasn't known for his superior intellect. Horus, who had inherited his mother's talent for clever solutions, built a boat of wood and painted it to look like stone. Because sometimes the best way to win a rigged game is to rig it right back. Set, being Set, took the challenge literally. He carved his boat from solid stone, quite proud of his craftsmanship, right up until the moment he tried to launch it. Picture, if you will, this scene. Horus in his painted wooden boat, gliding smoothly across the Nile. Set standing beside his stone boat, which was doing exactly what stones do when placed in water. The audience of gods watched as Set's boat sank majestically to the bottom of the Nile, where it probably remains to this day, a monument to taking things too literally. Set displaying his usual grace in defeat, which is to say none at all, transformed into a hippopotamus and tried to sink Horus's boat. Because if you can't win fairly, you can at least make a spectacular scene. The gods, who had probably expected nothing less from this family drama, were still divided on their verdict. Some sided with Horus, others feared Set's strength and tantrums. The legal proceedings would continue. We will learn more of Horus and Set another night. For now, let's continue with more Sumerian tales. What follows is the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal. This is a story of misunderstandings, of divine mix-ups, and of a god who never meant to fall in love, but kind of did anyway. Picture the cosmos in layers. The bright realm above where gods lounged on clouds, drinking starlight and gossip, their skin gleaming like polished bronze, their laughter shaking mountains. Below them spread the middle world, where humans built their cities from mud and determination, writing their stories on clay tablets, praying to whichever god might be listening that day. And then, even further down, past where roots dare to grow, past where minerals dream of becoming gems, lay the great below. The underworld, not just dark, but darkness itself. Ereshkigal wasn't your typical goddess. She didn't care for the shine and sparkle of the realms above. Her crown was made of silence, her throne carved from endings, her palace built from the weight of every final breath ever taken. She preferred the company of shadows to the chatter of other deities, found more truth in whispers than in thunderous proclamations. The dead, at least, didn't lie, they had nothing left to lose. The gods above were having what they called a small gathering, though nothing gods do is ever small. The wine would flow like rivers, the food would refill itself, the music would make mortals weep if they could hear it. They sent invitations written on sheets of pure light, carried by winds that knew every shortcut between realms. Every deity who was anyone would be there. But there was one place setting that gave them pause, a chair made of darkness among all their golden thrones. Should they invite her? Could they not? Politics among immortals is a delicate dance. They composed the invitation carefully, each word weighed like precious stones. To Her Majesty Ereshkigal, Queen of the Great Below, Keeper of Final Destinies, Lady of the Longest Night, we request the honour of your divine presence. In her dark hall, Ereshkigal held the invitation, its light strange against her shadow-woven robes. She couldn't go up. The laws were ancient and clear. The Queen of the Dead must remain with her subjects, but to refuse would be politically unwise. Even in Death's realm, diplomacy has its place. So she called for her scribe, a shadow that had once been a priest of 7 gods, to compose her response, gracious, formal, proper, explaining her absence, promising a representative to attend in her stead. In her throne room of shadows, Ereshkigal pondered her choice. This wasn't just any message to deliver, this was divine politics, where a wrong word could start wars, where a misplaced gesture could cause centuries of grudges. Her messenger would need to be dignified enough to represent Death's realm, graceful enough to navigate divine etiquette, strong enough to carry her power, wise enough to speak with care, and loyal enough to return to the lands below. This last part was crucial. She chose Namtar, her vizier, a being of shadow and protocol, who wore authority like a cloak and carried destiny in his voice. Some called him Fate, others called him Doom, but mostly they called him Sir, and quickly did what he asked. She dressed him in robes woven from disciplined darkness, gave him a staff of office made from compressed endings, and placed upon his head a crown of proper etiquette. Even the dead have standards. Speak with my voice, she told him. Carry my regrets with grace. Explain that the laws bind even me, that the dead need their queen, that balance must be maintained. And don't forget to bring a gift. Gods love presents. The gift she chose was special. A box made of polished midnight, containing secrets only the dead know, wrapped in ribbons of shadow, tied with knots of mystery. The gods above loved exotic things, and what's more exotic than death? Namtar began his ascent, past layers of eternal silence, through caves of forgotten memories, up through the roots of mountains, past where worms turned to earth, through where seeds dreamed of spring, until he reached the mortal world. But going up was harder than coming down. Light worked differently here. Air moved strangely, and everything was so alive. It made Namtar uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's skin. The divine banquet hall gleamed like 1,000 suns having lunch. Gods lounged on clouds of light. Their laughter shook the stars. Their words created worlds. Their cups never emptied, their plates always full. When Namtar entered, the light dimmed slightly, as if reality itself needed to make space for this sliver of underworld in the bright realm above. Some gods shifted uncomfortably, and others tried not to stare. But here's where it gets interesting. Among the gathered gods was one called Nergal, who did something unthinkable. He didn't stand when Ereshkigal's messenger entered. A small thing, perhaps, but in divine politics, small things cause big problems. Nergal, god of war and plague, lounged upon his seat of burnished bronze, continued sipping his divine wine, while all other gods rose in respect. Perhaps he thought his power sufficient to ignore underworld protocol. Perhaps he simply didn't know better, though ignorance rarely excuses gods. The silence that followed wasn't just any silence. It was the kind of quiet that has weight and texture, the sort of hush that falls before mountains crumble, before storms break, before fates change. Namtar's eyes, dark as final moments, fixed upon the seated god. His voice, when he spoke, carried echoes of tomb doors closing. The Queen of the Great Below notes your comfort, Lord Nergal. She will remember this. In diplomatic speak, you're in trouble. The assembled deities shifted like stars avoiding an eclipse. Anu, king of the gods, frowned. Enlil coughed politely. Ishtar hid her smile behind her hand. They all knew what it meant, then the underworld took note of someone's behaviour. Still, Namtar performed his duty, presented Ereshkigal's regrets, delivered her mysterious gift, spoke her carefully crafted words. But throughout his speech, his dark gaze kept returning to the still-seated Nergal, making mental notes. When Namtar descended again, carrying not just his report, but a list of protocols broken, the air in the underworld grew colder. The shadows drew closer. The dead held their breath, metaphorically speaking. Everyone knew rules had been broken. The queen sat upon her throne, listening to Namtar's report, her face still as stone, but her eyes blazed with something between anger and interest. So, she said, this Nergal thinks himself above our laws. She drew darkness around her like a mantle of authority. Send word above. Tell them this god, this Nergal, must present himself before my throne. Let him learn the weight of underworld protocol. The summons she composed was a masterpiece of menace, polite on the surface, threatening in subtext, each word carefully chosen to make clear this wasn't a request, but a command. Even war gods answer to death. When the summons reached him, Nergal finally understood the gravity of his mistake. One doesn't simply ignore a call from the queen below, but neither does one simply walk into the realm of the dead, expecting to walk out again. He went to Ii, god of wisdom. Gods need advice sometimes too, who listened to his predicament with the patience of mountains. Ah, said Ea, stroking his beard, you've managed to offend the one goddess who literally holds power over endings. Ea, wise as ancient rivers, gave counsel deep as ocean trenches. Listen carefully, young god of war, for entering the great below is not like storming earthly gates. You cannot fight your way through this, cannot burn or break or battle. This requires subtlety. Take with you these gifts, he said, producing objects strange and potent. A chair that cannot be refused, a table that always serves truth, a cup that holds both life and death, a comb that orders chaos, and a mirror that shows what one most needs to see. But remember these rules, Ea stressed, his voice heavy with prophecy. Do not eat her food, do not drink her wine, do not sit upon her chairs, do not lay upon her beds, do not answer her advances should she make them. Gods are terrible at following rules. Down went Nergal, past the roots of mountains, through caves of never morning, along stairs carved from absence, each step taking him further from the realm of living light into the domain of organized darkness where different rules applied. The underworld palace rose before him, not built but rather grown from compressed eternities, its walls smooth as frozen time, its corridors curved like final thoughts, its ceilings lost in perpetual twilight. Guards made of ended stories opened doors of polished darkness, and there she sat, Ereshkigal, queen of the great below, on her throne of compressed endings. But she wasn't what he expected. No crone of death and darkness, but a queen of terrible beauty. Power wrapped in shadow and grace, eyes deep as forever. "So," she said, voice like silk sliding over sharpened steel. "This is the god who thinks the Underworld's protocols beneath his notice?" Her words carried weight, each syllable a judgment, each pause a pending sentence. Nergal, for once in his existence, found himself without words. War gods rarely need diplomacy, but here in her domain, his usual strategies meant nothing. Instead, he presented Ir's gifts, each one laid before her throne with newfound humility. Something shifted in her gaze, like shadows changing angle, as she studied not the gifts, but the god who brought them. Perhaps she saw something there, in his uncharacteristic grace, that spoke of possibilities neither had considered. "You will stay," she declared, "for 7 days and 7 nights. Learn our ways, observe our laws, understand the realm you mocked." It wasn't a request or punishment, but something in between, a sentence and an opportunity, a challenge and an invitation. Servants made of whispers showed him to his chambers, walls of polished obsidian, furniture carved from midnight, a bed draped in dark silks that seemed to absorb light. Everything designed to remind him he was not in his realm anymore. The first day, Nergal learned that darkness had textures. Velvet soft in the libraries where dead scribes kept records, sharp as blade edges in the halls where judgments were passed, liquid smooth in the gardens where crystal flowers bloomed. At dinner she tested him, offering delicacies of the dead, pomegranates of polished garnets, wine made from remembered summers, bread baked from the wheat of farmers' final harvests. He remembered E's warning and ate nothing, drank nothing. The next day she made him watch as she worked. Souls came before her throne, each life weighed carefully, each death given proper measure. He saw her dispense justice with wisdom he hadn't expected, mercy he hadn't imagined, power wielded with perfect precision. They spoke of war and endings the following day, finding unexpected common ground. "Death in battle," she mused, "sends me so many souls, each carrying their last moment like a gift or burden." He began to understand the weight of his profession. The day after that, in the great library of the dead, she showed him scrolls of history written from death's perspective. Great battles seen from their end, empires viewed from their fall, heroes watched from their final breath. He saw his own wars reflected in the eyes of the fallen. Their discussions grew deeper the following day, like roots seeking water. She asked about life above. He asked about death below. Each answer led to more questions. Each question led to understanding, and understanding led to something neither expected. The next morning, in her gardens of crystal and shadow, where flowers grew from memories and trees bore fruits of wisdom, they walked together, talking of the nature of existence, the purpose of endings, the beauty in transitions, the power in transformation. That evening at dinner, their hands almost touched, reaching for the same goblet. The air grew thick with possibility. The shadows leaned in to watch. The dead held their breath, figuratively speaking, of course, but both pulled back, remembering their roles, their realms, their rules. The day after that, she let him sit beside her throne as she dispensed her duties, watching her weigh hearts against truth and balance mercy against necessity. He saw kingship in her grace, strength in her compassion, beauty in her terrible purpose. The dead played music on instruments of shadow and bone. They danced these powers, war and death entwined, their movements writing poetry in the language of darkness. The underworld itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The following day, something had changed in Nergal. The brash god of war and plague found himself transformed, like metal reshaped by fire. He understood now. Her realm wasn't just about endings, but about the weight of existence, the meaning found in mortality. In his chambers, Nergal paced, torn between duty and desire. Above, his realm of war waited. Below, something new called. E's warnings echoed hollow now, against the pull of her presence, the allure of her power, the depth of her understanding. The last day moved too quickly, like water through cupped hands, each moment precious, each second slipping away. Both knew what came next, the required farewell, the return above, the ending neither wanted. The seventh night arrived like an unwanted guest, heavy with inevitability. They sat in her private chambers, where even the shadows seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen when protocol met passion. Ereshkigal spoke first, her voice soft as tomb dust. "You understand now, don't you? Why we have our protocols, why the barriers exist, why above and below must remain separate." But her eyes said something else. Nergal, god of war and flame, found himself fighting the greatest battle of his existence, not with weapons or strength, but with rules and desire. He looked at her throne of darkness, at her crown of endings, at her eyes full of forever. Perhaps it was the way the starlight of the underworld caught in her hair like destiny, or how the shadows curved around her form like devotion. Perhaps it was simply time for chaos to enter order, for fire to meet darkness. He reached for her, forgetting E's warnings, forgetting divine protocol, forgetting everything except the magnetic pull between them. Their kiss tasted of pomegranates, of endings and beginnings, of rules magnificently broken. The underworld itself shuddered. Crystals chimed in the gardens. Dead poets began writing frantically. The 5 rivers changed their courses. The judges looked up from their scrolls, and somewhere in the distance 1,000 souls sighed at the romance of it all. But breaking divine law has divine consequences. The palace walls began to shift. Reality started to bend. Power surged through the realm like lightning through water. The barriers between worlds began to blur and break. They had mere moments to decide. He could flee back above, pretend nothing had happened, return to his realm of war, or he could stay and face whatever punishment the gods would devise for this breaking of ancient laws. The queen of the great below rose to her full height, power crackling around her like contained midnight. "If you leave now," she said, "I will set the dead themselves to drag you back below. Some rules, once broken, stay broken." And Nergal, mighty in battle, fierce in combat, lord of plagues, did something completely new. He knelt before her throne, not in defeat but in choice, not in submission but in alliance. "My queen," he said simply, "I choose the darkness." The underworld transformed around them. Where there was one throne, now 2. Where there was only ending, now renewal. Where there was only death, now passion. The very fabric of the realm rewove itself to accommodate this unexpected union of war and death, flame and shadow. Word spread through the heavens like wildfire through summer fields. The god of war had gone rogue, chosen death's embrace, broken ancient boundaries, mixed separate spheres. The divine court erupted in celestial scandal. Anu called an emergency council, gods gathering like storm clouds. Enlil, lord of air and earth. Enki, master of sweet waters. Ishtar, queen of love and battle. Each with their own agenda, each with their own concern about this unprecedented merger. "This cannot stand," thundered Enlil. "Order must be maintained." "But love is love," argued Ishtar, something of an expert there. "The balance shifts," worried Shamash, "when war beds down with death." Ea alone remained silent, hiding his knowing smile. Meanwhile, below, change bloomed. The palace gained new wings where light and shadow danced. The gardens grew fierce flowers that bloomed with warriors' courage. The libraries added scrolls where war's wisdom merged with death's deep knowing. A plague god's absence left mortals unprotected from unchecked diseases. Death without war's mercy became too kind or cruel. The realms needed balance, the new way of being, a solution none had seen. Ereshkigal and Nergal devised a revolutionary arrangement. 6 months above, 6 below, like Inanna's sacred pattern. When above, he'd guide war's course. When below, he'd judge with her, their powers interweaving like threads in cosmic fabric. They taught both realms a different kind of wisdom. How death makes life precious, how war can bring peace, how endings birth beginnings, how darkness needs light, how breaking some rules creates better ones. Before the divine assembly they presented their case, not as rebels or rule breakers, but as architects of new order. They showed how their union strengthened both domains, how balance was maintained through apparent contradiction. After much deliberation, divine councils move slowly, the gods reach consensus. This union would be sanctioned, this merger would be blessed, this new pattern accepted as part of cosmic order, written into divine law. And so it came to be that death gained war's passion, that war learned death's wisdom, that endings gained purpose, that destruction found meaning, that separate spheres could merge and strengthen, creating something greater. The consequences of their union were vast. First came the practical changes. Souls of fallen warriors no longer wandered lost between battle and judgment. They found their way easier now, guided by understanding born of this divine union between war and afterlife. Other gods took notice. If death could wed war, what other combinations might prove powerful? Alliances shifted like stars. New partnerships formed. Old rivalries dissolved in possibility's wake. In the mortal realm, battles transformed. Warriors began honouring both victory and death, understanding now that combat was not just about glory, but about the sacred transition between life and ending, between strength and surrender. Priests of both domains learned to work together. Death priests studied strategy. War priests learned grief rites. Their temples slowly merged into centres of wisdom where living and dying were equally honoured. The realm of death grew richer. Now warrior spirits stood guard. Strategic minds helped judge complex cases of karma, while death's deep wisdom tempered war's hot justice, creating perfect balance between mercy and might. In the world of mortals, new customs emerged. Soldiers learned death prayers. Funeral rites gained warrior honours. Battlefields became sacred spaces where both gods were invoked, their combined blessing sought for honourable combat and peaceful passing. Other gods had to adjust their spheres of influence. Ishtar shared war's domain, Shamash modified justice, while Ea smiled secretly, knowing his wisdom had helped forge this new arrangement that strengthened all realms. Stories changed in telling. Heroes now gained glory not just through victory, but through noble endings. Death became not defeat, but transformation. War not mere destruction, but sacred transition. Divine accountants discovered an unexpected truth. When death and war worked together, both realms grew stronger. Souls flowed more smoothly, power balanced perfectly, creation and destruction danced in harmony. The universe itself seemed to approve. Stars burned brighter, fate threads grew stronger, time flowed smoother through this new pattern where opposite forces found perfect union. Perhaps most importantly, gods and mortals learned. Power shared grows stronger, wisdom doubled cuts deeper, love can bridge any chasm, change can strengthen order, and even the most ancient rules sometimes need breaking. Future cultures carried echoes of this divine revelation. Norse Valkyries bore its mark, guiding warriors with death's grace. Greek Thanatos gained war's honour. Celtic Morrigan embodied both. The marriage of might and ending woven into newer myths. Great thinkers through ages found wisdom in this union. How opposition breeds strength, how barriers breed stagnation, how seeming contradictions often hide deeper truths, how death gives life meaning, how conflict brings peace. Temples change their nature, no longer purely places of either war or death, but sanctuaries where both powers were honoured together. Altars bore double symbols. Priests wore merged regalia. Rituals blended purposes. Warriors developed traditions of contemplating death, not as failure or opponent, but as wise companion. They learned to fight not just with weapons and strength, but with understanding of life's sacred transitions. Kings and queens discovered new ways of wielding power, not just through force of arms or fear of mortality, but through understanding how endings shape beginnings, how strength needs wisdom, how power needs purpose. Healers gained insights from this divine marriage, understanding how to balance fighting against death with accepting its necessity, when to wage war on illness, when to help guide patients toward peaceful endings. Even in today's world, these echoes still sound in hospice warriors who fight for gentle deaths, in soldiers who honour those they must face, in leaders who understand the weight of their decisions. Perhaps most profoundly, individual souls learn to face their own endings with warriors' courage, to approach their battles with death's wisdom, finding strength in acceptance, grace in resistance. Scholars now recognise in this ancient tale a universal truth, how seeming opposites often complement, how barriers broken can lead to strength, how love transforms all, and still they reign together, death and war entwined, neither diminished by their shared power, both made greater by their union, teaching all who watch the wisdom of integration. Their story reminds us still that love defies category, that power shared multiplies, that wisdom comes from union, that strength lies in balance, that rules sometimes must bend to accommodate truth, that endings birth beginnings. This union also had far-reaching effects on religion. First, the ancient faiths began subtle transformations. Egyptian Anubis gained aspects of Horus, Greek Ares learned from Hades, Roman Mars walked with Pluto, each pantheon finding ways to merge strength with ending, power with transition. Later in medieval times, Christian knights developed complex death philosophies. The warrior-monk emerged. Fighting with contemplation, Templar wisdom spoke of how to wage war with sacred purpose, while keeping death's wisdom close as a constant companion. In Buddhist traditions, the story found kinship. Warrior monks who understood death as transformation, martial arts that taught how ending and action, power and acceptance, dance in eternal balance. Even today's global conflicts echo ancient lessons. How force without wisdom breeds only destruction. How death without honour loses sacred purpose. How power untempered by understanding fails. Nuclear age brought new relevance to their tale. When war gained death's scale, when single actions could end not just battles but worlds, their wisdom spoke clearly. Power needs conscious wielding. Strength needs deep knowing. Modern therapy draws from their ancient wisdom, how to face our endings with warrior's courage, how to fight our battles with death's perspective, how to find strength in accepting limits. Their story even speaks to today's ecological crisis, how destruction and renewal must find sacred balance, how fighting for life means accepting change, how endings can birth new ways of being. In conflict resolution, their lesson emerges. how opposing forces might find common ground, how apparent enemies might become allies, how understanding bridges the widest divides. Their story teaches still that opposites attract for cosmic purpose, that boundaries crossed can strengthen order, that love's transformative power bridges deepest chasms and creates the strongest unions.